Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Now, today's section, I want to quickly clear certain things regarding the bony thorax and its associated joints. So, without much ado, let's quickly set the ball rolling. Now remember that we talk about the bony thorax. The important components are going to be the ribs, going to be the vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, as well as even the sternum. These represent important components of the bony thorax. Of course, we know that there will be costal cartilages. Yes, there will be intervertebral disc, which also play a role as far as the thoracic cage is concerned. But of course, with the bony thorax, we are interested in the bones. Now, so I want us to actually get certain things clear. Although I've done the rib, I've done the vertebrae, please you can visit those videos of mine, okay, to get more insight. This to actually make some quick important points for your comprehension. Now if you take a typical thoracic vertebrae, remember that we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, okay. So these ones, we are going to have what we call the typical ones are going to be the thoracic vertebrae 2 all the way to thoracic vertebrae 8, and we look at the features of the atypical ones as well. So if you take a typical thoracic vertebrae, just like any other vertebra, it's going to have two main areas. It's going to have a body, okay, so this is the body which orients anterior. This is a superior view and this is a lateral view. This is the body which orients anteriorly, and it will have an arch, okay, projecting posteriorly. Now on the body, if we are the body is going to be heart shaped, you're going to present with this heart shaped body. But on the body we are going to have articular facets for the articular facet which we find on the head of the rib, okay. So that yes, what you can see is that these ones you can see superior articular facets. Now the key thing is that for a typical thoracic vertebra, these facets should be demi-facets, should be half facets. They shouldn't be full complete facets. So anytime we see that a particular vertebra is having a complete facet, then we know that vertebra, thoracic vertebra, is atypical. Apart from that, we also have an inferior facets. So there will be two demi-facets on either side of the body of the vertebra, and then there will be two inferior demi-facets similarly on either side. Now these demi-facets are going to articulate with the facet that we find on the head of the rib, okay. So that is one key thing that you are supposed to know, okay. Now for some of the vertebrae, you may lack some of these facets. Sometimes you may not have the inferior facets. So if they are not there, then it makes it also atypical, okay. Now apart from having this body, then there will also be an arch. There will also be an arch. Now this arch actually gives rise to this kind of vertebral foramen. This arch will be formed by anterior pedicle and a posterior lamina, as you know. And then of course, apart from that, projecting from this arch will be two main processes. One which projects in the midline, okay, of the body posteriorly. That's what we call the spinous process. Now the key identifying feature of the thoracic vertebra or typical thoracic vertebra is that its spinous process, yes, although it is orienting posteriorly, no problem, but it actually projects downwards. So it has a caudally oriented, inferiorly pointing spinous process, which is quite long, okay. And then apart from that, we are also going to have what we call the transverse process. Now the key thing, this vertebral foramen is actually oval in shape. It's quite rounded, oval in shape. And then we're going to have these two other processes, okay, which we call them transverse processes on either side, transverse processes. Now the key thing over here again is that on the transverse process, for a typical thoracic vertebra, you are supposed to have what we call facet, articular facet on the transverse processes. So we can see they have articular facet, and this one is for articulation with the articular part of the tubercle of the rib. So we will see that. So these are the main things that we are supposed to see, okay. Apart from yes, having the superior notch, the inferior vertebral notches, which are common to other, vertebrae. So these are the key things. Yes, we're going to present with this body, which is heart shaped. On the body, we are going to have two facets at its upper aspect and two facets at its lower aspect. And then we're going to have what we call its oval shaped foramen. We're going to have inferior pointing spinous process, and on the spinous process, and then on the transverse processes we are going to have what we call articular facets for articulation with the corresponding transverse process corresponding facet that we find on the tubercle of the rib. Okay, so that's what we have. However, there are some vertebrae. Okay, I've told you that vertebrae number 2 all the way to 8 are typical vertebrae because they possess all these features that we've made mention of. Now, for the atypical ones, they have slightly different features which are worth mentioning, and therefore they are atypical. So, for instance, if you take thoracic vertebra number 1, it is atypical because you can see its superior facet. It's actually an entire one. Okay, a superior facet is an entire one, but its inferior surface facet will be demi. So by way of the inferior facet, no problem, but the superior facet being a full facet, okay, being a full facet, then it makes it atypical. So that is with thoracic vertebra number 1. Now if you take thoracic vertebra number 9, okay, I told you that from 2 or to 8 they are the typical. So thoracic vertebra 9 is also atypical. Now the reason why it's atypical is that yes, it's having a single demifacet on the body. Now one thing that you have to know is that any other feature that we made mention of will be consistent with these ribs that we are still calling them atypical. For instance, on the transverse processes there will be that kind of demifacet on the transverse processes. Okay, so these ones will bear the demifacet, no problem. But for this one, you can see that it's bearing only superior demifacet. Okay, so you don't have the demifacet at its lower aspect. Okay, so that's one thing. It also makes it atypical because it's lacking the inferior demifacet. So thoracic vertebra 9 is atypical because it is not having the inferior demifacet. Now again, you get to know that yes, the superior facet for that of 10, 11 and 12 bear a full facet. So for 10, 11 and 12 vertebrae, they are bearing full facet, and they are actually the superior facet, and they don't have the inferior demifacet either. Neither do they have the inferior demifacet, and therefore they are also atypical. Now apart from that, for thoracic vertebra number 11 and 12, okay, thoracic vertebra number 11 and 12, they don't have facets on their what we call the transverse processes. Okay, so on the transverse processes of thoracic vertebra 11 and of course 12, they don't have facet for articulation with the articular part of the tubercle of the rib. And the reason is simple because on these corresponding ribs, that's 11 and of course 12, they're also atypical ribs, which we'll get to. And the reason is that they also do not have a neck, neither do they have these tubercles, and therefore it makes sense that thoracic vertebra 11 and 12 do not have articular facets, okay, like as you see for these ones on the transverse processes. So these are the reasons why these ones are atypical, so please get that one in mind. Now talking about the bony thorax, then it's worth mentioning that yes, we talk about the ribs. But even before we talk about the rib, one key thing is that which we are going to help distinguish between the three main kinds of ribs that we have. Talking about true ribs, talking about false rib, and then even under this type of false rib we have the floating ribs. So before we look at that, then the next thing that for us to do is for us to talk about the sternum. Okay, the sternum being the breastbone, which you find in the midline of the body, an important component of the axial skeleton. Yes, this gladial shaped structure, which we call the sternum, yes, is having this portion, superior portion, which we call the manubrum, and of course this is the body of the sternum or the sternibrae or the gladiolus part, and then this is the xiphoid process. Okay, so we get to know that yes, you see that on its superior portion there will be a notch, which we call the suprasternal notch, otherwise you call it the jugular notch, and then we have articular areas for the various costal cartilages of the rib. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. I've done the rib, the sternum. Please get to know. If you go and watch that video, you get more insight in that. Now we have what we call true ribs. Okay, so if we're a true rib, then you are rib number 1 all the way to rib number 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, these represent what we call the true ribs. And these true ribs, yes, the reason is that they have direct attachment to what we call the sternum through their costal cartilages. So individually they will attach separately, independent of one another or of each other, so that they can attach to the sternum. Through their costal cartilages. As a result, we call these true ribs. We call them vertebro-costal, or usually vertebro-sternal ribs. And then from rib number 8 all the way to rib number 12, we call them false ribs. Okay, we call them false ribs. Now the reason why, but with the false rib we can identify the first rib group, which we call them also false rib anyway, and that's rib number 8 all the way to, so you can see this is rib number 8, number 9, and of course number 10. So 8, 9, 10. So these ribs are false ribs. Now they are able to connect to the sternum, but this time around indirectly, because at the end of the day their costal cartilages come together to form a single costal cartilage which connects to the body of the sternum, and therefore we call these ribs vertebro-chondral ribs, because they have a common costal cartilage to attach to what we call the body of the sternum. So these are what we call the false ribs. Okay, the superior portion of the false rib. Now the inferior aspect, where the last two ribs, that's rib number 11 and of course rib number 12, they are not able to have that kind of contact either directly or indirectly to the sternum, and therefore we call them floating ribs. Or simply we call them vertebral ribs, because they have attachment to only the vertebrae. Now one key thing for us to know is that in most cases what happens is that their tips, their interiormost part will be covered by a small portion of this kind of hyaline cartilage, and therefore whenever they talk about ribs without costal cartilages, then there is none like that, because all these ones, although they don't attach directly or indirectly to the body of the sternum, what happens is that they have some small aspect of what you call hyaline cartilage forming their costal cartilages. So please bear that one in mind. Now, having seen what we call true rib and then false rib, one other thing too for us to know is that some of the ribs are typical and others are atypical. So the first thing is that, yes, what are the features that make a particular rib typical? And then once we don't see some of those features, then that means that the other one will be atypical. So if you take the rib, the rib is a flat bone, actually having this kind of slender like appearance. It's not quite stout, it's quite slender. And then posteriorly, this is from posterior to anterior, because this area will be where the costal cartilage will attach, and these costal cartilages attach anteriorly and connect to what we call the body of the sternum. So I'm starting with the posterior aspect. So from posterior aspect we are going to have a head. So the typical rib will bear a head, and then on its head superiorly we are going to have what we call the superior articular facet, and there will be an inferior articular facet, which we said that is why if we take the typical thoracic vertebra, it will have two facets, superior ones and inferior facets. Now separating these two facets will be this crest. So there's a crest, this area for the rib, and then we will also bear a neck. So from the head we will bear the neck. Now moving away from the neck, we have what we call the tubercle. We have the non-articular tubercle and then the articular part. So this articular part is for articulation with the articular facet that we find on the transverse process of the typical thoracic vertebra or whatever. And then from there, this rib takes a curve, it sharply turns, and then gives us this angle, and then from all the way gets to the anterior aspect. Now one key thing is that at the inferior aspect, internal aspect of the inferior aspect, there's this groove over here, and this groove is what we call the costal groove. This costal groove, will admit the neurovascular structures, that we find in the intercostal, that we find actually in the thoracic neurovascular bundle, plane. Okay, this is that area where, of course, we know the intercostal vein, intercostal artery, intercostal nerve. Yes, by way of fun, you can remember those structures from superior to inferior. Okay, this area. So if you take a typical rib, it bears a head. On its head, we are going to have superior facet, articular facet, inferior articular facet. In between them, there will be a crest separating them, and then there will be a neck. Then, of course, we are going to have a tubercle, a non-articular part, and an articular part, which the articular part is of importance to us because that's the area which is going to, form that kind of articulation with that we find on the transverse process of, the vertebrae, corresponding vertebrae actually, thoracic vertebrae. And then this the angle, and then of course, we have this groove, below it. So these are the features that we want to see in a typical vertebra. However, there are some ribs, okay? So if you take actually rib number, number 3 all the way to rib number 10, okay? So those ones will be typical, okay? So if you take, those ribs, rib number, 3, rib number 4, rib number, 5, rib number 6, okay? Rib number 7, okay? So those ones will be typical ribs. But these ribs, okay, which we can see them over here, are actually atypical. So rib number 1, why is rib number 1 atypical? The reason is that rib number 1 bears only a single facet at its superior aspect. Now the reason is that there's no any other thoracic vertebra above it, so it bears a single facet on its head. Then, of course, just like any other, rib, it will bear a tubercle, articular for articulation with, transverse process of the corresponding, vertebrae. And then one key thing is that this one is too stout, is too broad, and again, it sharply gives that angle. And then one other thing too is that yes, it's bearing two areas, two grooves. So there are two main blood vessels which will be related to, of course, the first rib. And these blood vessels, one is a vein, that's a subclavian vein. So remember, subclavian vein will be more anterior, okay, than the groove for the subclavian artery, because subclavian vein, is more superficial, so to speak, and this subclavian artery will be a bit deeper. But in between them will be the insertion point, okay, in between these two groups. So subclavian artery, its groove will be posterior, because as you get closer to where the head is, then you are going posteriorly. And in between them, the groove for subclavian vein and subclavian artery will be the insertion point for scalenus, anterior muscle. And therefore, we have what we call scalene tubercle over there. Okay, so this is why rib number 1 is atypical. The rib number 1 is atypical because it's quite stout, it's quite broad, it's sharply tense, it's having only a single facet on its head. Apart from that, it's having, two grooves on its, superior aspect, groove for subclavian vein, more anteriorly, and posterior place will be groove for subclavian artery. In between them will be a tubercle for, scalenus anterior muscle. So that is why rib number 1 is atypical. Now rib number 2 is atypical, yes, because apart from having the superior and inferior facet, no problem, the tubercle will bear a facet, no problem. But one other thing is that it has a roughened area on the superior portion. Now the roughened area is for insertion for the second digitation of the serratus anterior muscle, and therefore this area is called tuberosity for serratus anterior muscle. It's because of this tuberosity that makes the second rib atypical. Now rib number 8, okay, sorry, rib number 10 actually. Rib number 10 is also atypical. It's not rib number 8, because rib number 8 is typical. Okay, rib number 9 is also typical. So this is rib number 10. Now rib number 10, yes, no problem, it's bearing a superior articular facet, okay, but you can see that it's not having an inferior one. Okay, rib number 8 is not bearing that kind of inferior one. Okay, so that makes, sorry, rib number 10 actually is not bearing the superior one. Okay, so that is one thing that we find over here. But for rib number 11 and rib number 12, they are not having a neck. Because they are not having a neck, In fact, they also not having those kind of tubercles for articulating with the transverse processes of the corresponding ribs. So that is what we find over here. Again, they also have only a single facet on their head. Okay, so rib number 10, 11 and 12 will bear a single facet on their head. Apart from that, rib number 11 and rib number 12, okay, will bear, apart from bearing a single facet on their head, will also not have a neck, and they also will not have tubercles. Okay, that's what we see. Now, moving on, we want to look at some joints that we find in the thoracic cage. Okay, and those joints, yes, one of them is the costochondral joint. So the word is costochondral. So costal has to do with the rib, and chondral has to do with these cartilages that we find them here. So these costochondral joints, okay, the one you find here, yes, all the way here, you can see those ones. These costochondral joints are actually primary cartilaginous joint. Yes, I've done those joint. Please visit that video to get more insight. But one key thing over here is that for you to know that they are costochondral joints, okay, one key thing is that yes, they will be made of hyaline cartilage. They will be made of hyaline cartilage. Okay, so hyaline cartilage. If it is cartilaginous, it could be of hyaline cartilage. If it's hyaline cartilage, then it's primary cartilaginous joint. Now, for the fibrocartilage, you get to know that usually we find them in the midline of the body. Okay, such as the vertebral disc. Okay, such as the mandible, sternal joint. We will see those ones. But now this portion of, okay, now you can see this is a costal cartilage. The lateral portion of the costal cartilage is the portion which articulates with the anterior aspect of these ribs, and that is what we call the costochondral joint, primary cartilaginous joint. Okay, now if you look at the medial aspects of these costal cartilages, they're also forming that kind of articulation with, of course, the sternum. In fact, this type of joint, okay, over here from the second all the way to the seventh one is actually what we call synovial joint. Okay, surprisingly, this is made of synovial joint, although there's still cartilage over here, and therefore it could have been that kind of primary cartilaginous joint. It is not so. It is made of it is actually a synovial plain synovial type of joint. Okay, so that is what we will see here. So it means that there's going to be a joint cavity. There will be synovial fluid in there, so that it can permit that kind of slide movement. Okay, but the first, okay, between the mandible, okay, and the first costal medial aspect of the first costal cartilage, it is actually what we call a primary cartilaginous joint. That one is a primary cartilaginous joint, which will not really permit some kind of movement. Okay, so please, you have to understand this. Yes, the lateral aspects of these costal cartilages articulating with the anterior aspect of these ribs, no problem. Costochondral joint, therefore hyaline cartilaginous. That's primary cartilaginous, or synchondrosis. Then for these areas, the medial aspects of these costal cartilages and the rib, and the sternum, that one is what you call sternocostal or stenochondral joint. Now these ones from 2 to 7, they are going to be what we call plain synovial joint, but the first one is going to be made of hyaline, and therefore primary cartilaginous joint, permitting no movement. So that is one thing. Now the other thing is what we call the mandibulo-sternal joint. Now usually for fibrocartilaginous joints, they are found in the midline of the body. So if you talk about intervertebral disc, if you talk about mandibulo-sternal joint, if you talk about symphysis menti, yeah, usually PB symphysis, they are usually found in the midline of the body. Okay, so this mandibulo-sternal joint is actually a secondary cartilaginous joint. That's what we call symphysis. Okay, so that's what you see here. But a surprising thing is that the xiphy-sternal joint, okay, between the body of the sternum and the xiphoid process, although it's found in the midline of the body, it is not, a secondary cartilaginous joint, okay, or symphysis, but rather it's a synchondrosis type of joint. It is a primary cartilaginous joint because here it's made of hyaline cartilage. Yeah, that's why it's not surprising, but as one ages, it becomes synostotic. Okay, bony. So these are some joints that we find over here. Okay, so we can also have what we call the sternoclavicular joint. It's also that kind of what we call the condyloid. the saddle type of joint. We see those ones. Now, apart from that, there's that kind of connection in between some of these what we call costal cartilages, which did not directly attach to what we call the body of the sternum, and those ones form that kind of joint that we call interchondral joint. So it tells you chondra has to do with cartilage. In between those cartilages, there will be an interchondral joint. Surprisingly, this type of joint is also synovial, plain synovial joint, which means there is going to be a joint cavity in between them. Okay, so it means the 8. Okay, so count, yes, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, 8 downwards. Okay, all these areas we are going to have that kind of interchondral joint in between these kind of costal cartilages, So, but one key thing is that, yes, as one ages, okay, they tend to become fibrous. Okay, they tend to become fibrous. So that's interchondral joint, may also synovial joint. Now, I want to just quickly organize whatever joint we've been talking about, so that if you talk about the intervertebral disc, or the joint over there, is actually, because found in the midline of the body, it's a symphysis type of joint, and that's secondary cartilaginous. Okay, bounding the bodies of adjacent thoracic vertebrae or other vertebrae together. Okay, so you see that later on we get to know the ligament which will be associated with it, anterior and posterior longitudinal ligaments. We see those ones. And then we also have what we call the costovertebral joint. Okay, you said that one between, of course, the head, the articular facet that we found on the head, as the head of what we call the rib, and then of course the body of what we call the vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae. It's actually a synovial type of joint. There's a joint cavity. Okay, so one key thing is that the head of each rib with superior demifacet or costal facet for corresponding vertebral. So the superior one is for attaching to corresponding vertebra, and then of course the inferior demifacet, okay, articulate with the other body of superior, or costal facet of vertebral body superior to it. Okay, that's how it goes. The superior one to the corresponding one, and then of course the inferior one, okay, will attach to that kind of vertebrae superior to it. And then, so that is one thing. Okay, but we said that, okay, it says hairs of 1st, 11th and 12th ribs, sometimes even 10th, articulate only with corresponding vertebral body. Okay, in fact, one key thing here is that for the 11th, okay, yes, so for 1st, 11th, 12th ribs, and even sometimes even a 10th may articulate with corresponding vertebrae, body of vertebrae. Then we have what we call the costotransverse. Okay, for the costotransverse, the name tells you, the costal, the articular, facets on the tubercle, and the transverse, the facet on the transverse of the body of the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, that's actually also that kind of synovial, plain synovial joint. Okay, so that's one thing. And the key thing over here is that 11th and 12th ribs do not articulate with the transverse process. We said those ones do not have the articular facets on their transverse processes. Likewise, the vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, do not have articular facets for them. They also have the costochondral. Okay, so costochondral, we said, is a primary cartilaginous joint, hyaline cartilage, and that one, yes, we saw that one is, usually will not permit that kind of movement. Okay, and then we also have that kind of interchondral that we just saw. We said that's going to be a synovial plain synovial joint, articulation between the costal cartilages of 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th. Okay, that's what we see, and we see later on that we find that kind of interchondral ligaments also being associated there. But the key thing is that articulation between the costal cartilages of 9th and 10th is fibrous. I've told you that as one ages, yes, these ones tend to become fibrotic. Then we also have the sternocostal. Okay, sternocostal, no doubt the first one is a primary cartilaginous, it's a synchondrosis type, and then the remaining one, 2nd to 7th, will be a synovial type of plain joint, plain synovial joint. And these ones, yes, the first one, okay, because it's prime cartilaginous, will permit no movement, but these ones may permit some kind of slight movement. Then we have the sternoclavicular, which is a saddle type of synovial joint, okay, between the sternal end of the clavicle, the mandible of the sternum, and first costal cartilage actually. So you see later that we have anterior and posterior sternoclavicular ligaments, which will be associated with it, and costoclavicular ligaments. Okay, so that's what you see. Then of course for the mandible sternal joint, yes, that one is going to be a secondary cartilaginous. It's actually a symphysis type. We said that usually in the midline of the body you have such a thing, but although the xiphosternal joint is in the midline of the body, it's actually a synchondrosis type of joint. So that is one thing that I want you to know. So in this tutorial, yes, we've been able to look at the main features of a typical thoracic vertebra. Yes, we've seen that of the atypical ones. We've seen the typical rib, the features of the atypical rib actually, and then of course we've been able to look at some of these joints. Please visit the video that I've done on these bones, as well as the joint system that we've done, so that you get more insight in that. May God richly bless you, and may you have a good night.